And now, I think there is one problem with histories of philosophy. They tend to start with a system, with the answer, and to elaborate the answer. And if you do that for students for one term, and you have 20, 30 different systems, and you have to present it for them, and they have to understand what it's all about, I think that is pedagogically not a sound way of going about. So what is the way of doing it in this book? It's the other way. We try to raise a question first. What is a question that has gotten this answer? I recall to the audience that, for instance, the first philosopher in the Greek tradition, sort of philosopher, whether it's a natural philosopher, a scientist, or whatever, Thales, 500 before Christ, he said that everything is water. If you say that in Bergen, where it's raining a lot, it's a very sad start of the history of philosophy, I tell you, and it sounds as if that is just nonsense. But if you raise a question, what was the background? What could be the question that led to this answer? Then you could say, well, these philosophers wanted to understand what change is all about. If that is a question, that's an interpretation, but if that is a question, well, then you see there is a lot of water around. Water can evaporate into air, and it can freeze into hard stuff. That is, it can take various shapes: air, water, and solid stuff. And you can generalize from this argument that maybe either you have water or things that are made out of water. Then you have gotten a very primitive theory of change. And now you have 3 points: the question, the arguments, and the answer. And the answer is, in fact, the least interesting. And then the implication. Because what is the implication if everything is water? That is, if water is something you know and can control and understand, it means that you can understand everything in the universe. That's hubris. But that is an implication of that kind of rational reconstruction. So then what happens? Then you have Anaximander and Anaximenes said, well, if everything goes into everything, why water and what not? And you have the ongoing discussion until you end, for instance, with Democritus, and you have the theory of the atom theory, very close to modern thinking. And you have a development of thought. So there are 2 things that are important here. First, we have to look to the background. We have to see what kind of questions are raised. We have to see what kind of arguments, bad or good, that are being put in between the question and the answer. And you have to see the implications of the answer. That's the first part. And then the second, you have to see how this one philosopher is communicating in discussions with other philosophers, and there is an ongoing learning process. What's important about that? The important about this approach is that you get people to see why people end up with seemingly strange or either banal or difficult questions. And if not, I think it's very hard to get young people to be interested in the answer at all. Second point, and that has to do with what you are doing in philosophy, in this kind of philosophy. It's not that you are preaching. You do not want people to believe in Plato or Aristotle or Seneca, nor do you want simply to give them facts. What do you want? A third category, understanding. And understanding goes by seeing how questions are related to arguments, are related to answers, which in then have implications. And second point, how one position and one way of doing it relates to another one. It's not only that you have one philosopher here and next there, but there is an ongoing process. And you learn something by seeing how the thought can develop. I'll give another case. For instance, after the Renaissance, and you got the new natural sciences, Newton, later starting with Galilei, and that inspired the philosophers. And you got 2 branches. The one who said, well, the new natural science, that is experience in the sense of sensations, and you got empiricism. Then you had the other branches saying, well, but they end up with answers where you try to put formula in mathematical forms. So those were the rationalists. You have these 2 branches, and then you see how they work together, how they criticize each other from Locke to Berkeley to Hume, how they have an internal criticism, again a learning process, and you get insight by seeing how the ideas are developed in these positions. And you see the same in rationalism, ending up with Kant trying to make something in between rationalism and empiricism. What I'm trying to say is that this is not what we do when we have conferences in philosophy, in contemporary philosophy. Then we go straight on and discuss with colleagues in another way. But if you are to present it for non-philosophers, to get them to see the point with the whole thing, I think this is at least a way of getting into it. And then to the question, the relationship between philosophy and the history of ideas. Well, it all depends on how you define it. But I would say to understand something about philosophy is to understand those learning processes, to see how the ideas are raised and discussed and how they relate to each other in various philosophies. I think it's something in between the preaching and the giving facts. It's something that you can take part in without becoming a Kantian or becoming a Platonian or whatever you have. So, and then if you do not raise a question whether it's truth is a difficult question. My thesis was on the question of truth by Heidegger, by the way. But if philosophy isn't well grounded, then I'm not sure what, well, then it might be that you get new concepts that you just present, but you have no reasons why they should be more accurate and more interesting than other concepts. So I think some notion of validity, conceptual or being better than, I think is essential to philosophy. That we might discuss. But it's certainly also a creative aspect in philosophy. You open new perspectives. That's the artist part of it, by Heidegger and other people, that you try to see the world with new concepts. But it's also a discussion in philosophy to see whether some aspects are better, some concepts are better than other concepts. So it's both. So I think it's not, if history of ideas is just, how should we say, presentation, a description of positions without going into the arguments, then there is a difference. But this is a gradual difference. But I think being gradual, there is some difference to it. So I think as paradigmatic changes, you have the kind of more descriptive history of ideas, and you have a history of philosophy where you try to go into the ideas, and you have philosophy as you discuss it today without, for those who have been through these learning processes. I stop soon, but just another question which was major here, and that's the relationship between philosophy and other sciences, for instance. Well, as I mentioned, with the natural sciences in the Renaissance, I think it's difficult to understand both the empirical school, the rationalist school, and Kant without seeing them as people who react positively and creatively to the new natural sciences. And I think very much of the discussion in the medieval ages is related to theology, which is also a science. And also in Plato and Aristotle, they relate to various aspects, but also to the question whether there are universal norms. Not that there are equality between persons, that was not a Greek idea. They were more within society, a hierarchical society. But the question was raised after the skepticism of the sophists, whether there was something which is universal. And that is also a question for jurisprudence. So I think the relationship between the sciences, the various sciences, not only the natural sciences, and philosophy is important, and it shows it's difficult to my mind to see what's going on without seeing that relationship. And that means also that even though we can learn from the early Greeks, there have been changes all through history. Political, social changes, new institutions which they didn't have, but also new sciences, so that when you look back, they are always relevant for us, but there is also things that have gone on, passed by, which we have to relate to. So history of philosophy is a source of knowledge and reflection, but there are also things that tend to focus on where we are today, and that's where you end up at the end. I think in any history of philosophy, you write it from where you are, in a way,